Today I want to begin something I'm calling a summer of prophetic preaching. And I probably ought to begin with an explanation. Because some people describe prophetic preaching as preaching like the prophets, which could lead you to believe that you are in for a long summer of finger pointing and pulpit pounding and thus saith the Lord. That would be exciting, but that's not exactly what I have in mind. The lectionary readings over the next few weeks touch on the stories of the great prophets Elijah and Elisha. They delve into the writings of Amos and Hosea and Isaiah. They include some of the more confrontational teaching of Jesus and Paul. So it made sense to me to bundle them all together in one big package of prophetic preaching that will include both preaching like the prophets and preaching about the prophets. But before I do that, maybe I need to say a word about prophecy itself. Some people think of prophecy as a prediction of things to come. I hear them say this sometimes. I'm really into prophecy these days, and that means that they are searching the Scriptures, combing through those passages, looking for clues about the future. But in the Bible, prophecy is more often a matter of telling the truth than telling the future. I've only realized it in the last few years, but as I look through the Bible, I discover there are no prophets in Israel until there are kings in Israel, which ought to tell us something. Kings need a prophet from time to time because kings tend to believe that they are in charge of things. Some believe that they are in charge of everything, and they need a prophet who will come along and tell them that that is not necessarily so, that only God is in charge of everything. The problem is, for us, that prophets don't only speak to kings. They tend to tell the truth to us as well. They remind us that we are not in charge of everything either, and not nearly as important as we would sometimes like to believe. Eugene Peterson says about the prophets, for a people who are accustomed to fitting God into their lives, or as we like to say, making room for God, the prophets are hard to take and easy to dismiss. The God of which the prophets speak is far too large to fit into our lives. If we want anything to do with God, we have to fit into Him. The prophets are not reasonable, accommodating themselves to what makes sense to us. They are not diplomatic, tactfully negotiating an agreement that allows us a say in the outcome. What they do is haul us unceremoniously into a reality far too large to be accounted for by our explanations and expectations. They plunge us into mystery, immense and staggering. With that in mind, let's take a look at the prophet Elijah. His story begins in 1 Kings chapter 17, just after the writer has told us about Ahab, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And of all the wicked kings who ruled over that part of the land, Ahab was the wickedest, because he took as his wife a beautiful Sidonian princess named Jezebel. Maybe you've heard of her. She was a devout follower of Baal, one of the Canaanite gods. And when she married Ahab, she not only let him into her life, she led him into the worship of Baal. Before you know it, Ahab had built a temple to Baal in Israel and set up altars to Baal in Samaria. Elijah, the Tishbite, drops into the story at this point like a stone into a pond. Elijah, whose name means Yahweh is God, as if to make his point that Baal is not Elijah comes from Tishbe over on the other side of the Jordan River in the land of Gilead, all the way to the palace in Samaria to speak to King Ahab. It is a long journey. And along the way, Elijah probably got his feet wet in the Jordan, which may account for the way he talks to the king. There isn't a lot of formal introduction, no niceties, no political formalities. Ahab hears this word from Elijah: "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word." Let me interrupt the story just long enough to explain that the drought Elijah predicted would have been a slap in the face for Baal and all those who followed him, because Baal was known as the storm god. In the legends that were told in those days, he rode around on the clouds as if they were his chariots. He was the one who hurled lightning bolts down from heaven and clapped his hands together to make thunder. He was the one responsible for the rainfall. Since you needed rain to make things grow, and since growing things gave life, Baal could have been called the god of the good life. He was the rain maker. And when the rains came, the crops grew. And when the crops grew, you could sell them for cash. And if you had cash, you could buy anything your heart desired. The God of the good life. No wonder that people bowed down at his altar. No wonder that they leaped and danced and lost themselves in ecstatic frenzy. For Elijah to suggest that it was Yahweh who was in charge of the rainfall and not Baal was a direct affront to all those people who worshiped him, which is probably just what God had in mind. After Elijah delivered his message, God told him to go back across the Jordan River and sit beside the brook called Cherith. There, he said, the ravens will bring you bread and meat. For a while, everything went well. Elijah drank from the cool, clear waters of the brook. The ravens came in the morning and in the evening, bringing bread and meat. He ate better than most of the people in Israel in those days. But then, because of the drought, the brook dried up. And that's where today's story begins. God told Elijah to go to Zarephath, way up in Sidon, Jezebel's home country, deep in the heart of Baal worship. "Go up there," he said, "for I have commanded a widow there to feed you." But apparently the message hadn't gotten to the widow. When Elijah arrives at Zarephath, he finds her just outside the city gate picking up a few sticks, and he asks her to go and fetch him some water. As she is going, he says, "Oh, and by the way, could you bring me a little bite of bread to eat?" And that's when she turns around and looks at him and says, "As the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. I just have a handful of meal in a jar and a little bit of oil in a jug. I was just gathering these few sticks so that I could go home and build a fire and make some bread so that my son and I could eat one last meal before we die." The drought had been hard on everybody. But Elijah said, "Don't be afraid. Go, do exactly as you have said. But when you make the bread, bring me a little cake of it first, and then you and your son can eat the rest. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of meal will not be emptied, the jug of oil will not go dry, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And so she went and did as Elijah told her, and sure enough, in all the time that he was with her, there was grain in the jar, there was oil in the jug.